నమస్కారం. నా ఈ ప్రయత్నం మీకు నచ్చినట్లయితే గనక మన ఛానల్‌ని సబ్స్క్రైబ్ చేసుకొని, పై జాబితాలోని మరిన్ని వీడియోలను చూడటం ద్వారా మీ నైపుణ్యాలను, జ్ఞానాన్ని కూడా అభివృద్ధి చేసుకోవడానికి ప్రయత్నించండి. జై హింద్. Please like, share and subscribe for more videos. Thank you.
When opening a chess game, knights and bishops usually jump right into action. The rooks often have to wait, limited to helping pawns advance up the board, waiting for their chance to enter the game. Sometimes, rooks only find their full strength in later middle game and endgame positions, when more pieces get traded off, clearing space for the rooks to move across the board. Rooks are very powerful pieces in the endgame, and knowing their strengths and limitations can be the difference between winning or losing a chess game. Let's explore the powers of the rook in the endgame. In this position, the rook is battling white's passed pawn, which is only 3 squares away from promoting. A single pawn is usually no match for the powerful rook, but since black's king is completely out of the action, white's king and pawn working together can be a serious challenge for the rook. With white to move, it is very important to keep the king and pawn connected to fight against the rook together. So white plays king f4, moving the king up the board to help escort the pawn to the promotion square. Black's rook has a few choices, but the game should be a draw with accurate play from white. If black tries to cut off the king by playing rook to c5, white's pawn marches forward with g6. And if black tries to attack the pawn with rook to c6, if white rushes forward with g7, black's rook has separated the king and the passed pawn and now wins easily after rook g6, winning the pawn on the next turn. After rook c6, instead of pushing the pawn too far away from the king, white should keep the pawn and king together by playing king f5. White is now ready to play g7, when black's rook will have to sacrifice itself for the advanced pawn. If black tries to bring the king into the game with king b2, after g7, black's rook is forced to the back rank with rook c8. White's king marches up the board with king f6, and after king c3, king f7, black will have to sacrifice the rook for the passed pawn on the next turn, or draw the game with a perpetual check after rook c7 check, king f8, rook c8 check, king f7. Let's see if black had another way to try and win this endgame. Black can also try rook f1 check, and after king e5, black separates the king from the pawn, but the rook cannot both keep the king cut off from the pawn and prevent white's pawn from promoting. White draws the game by marching the king and pawn up the board, rank by rank, until black's rook will have to sacrifice itself for the pawn. If black tries to bring the king into the action with king b2, both sides continue with their plans after g6, king c3, and g7. Black's rook is now forced to prevent the pawn from promoting with rook g1, allowing white to connect the king and pawn with king f6. If black's king were in front of the pawn, this position would be easily winning for black. Since black's king is so far out of the action, white draws after king d4 and king f7. White is threatening to promote the pawn on the next turn, and black will need to sacrifice the rook. Let's take a look at this position again, except this time it will be black to move. We saw with white to move, the teamwork of the king and pawn was enough to draw against black's powerful rook and out-of-place king. With black to move, is the position still drawn? Can you see how black can cut off the white king from the passed pawn? That's right, by playing rook to c4. White's king can no longer help advance the pawn up the board. White loses quickly after g6. Now that the pawn cannot be protected by the king on the next turn, black wins the game with rook c6, threatening the pawn, and after g7, black collects the pawn with rook g6. White's best chance is to stay close to the pawn and wait with king g3. Since black's rook prevents the king from defending the pawn, and advancing the pawn loses for white, black can play the slow but effective plan of bringing the king into the game and attacking white's defenseless pawn. After the moves king b2, king f3, king b3, king g3, king b4, and king h3, black plays king c5. If white continues to move the king, black will simply move the king over to white's pawn and capture it. As black's king blocks the rook from moving up the board, white races to promote the pawn with g6. Black's king moves closer to the pawn and opens up the rook's path to the back rank with king d6. White is only one move away from promoting after g7, but black's rook catches the pawn in time with rook c8, and after king g4, black collects the pawn with rook g8. Let's take a look at another example together. In this position, black's pawn on a3 is under attack. If black advances with a2, white wins the pawn by forking the pawn and king with rook a3 check. What should black do? It's important to remember that rooks belong behind passed pawns, not in front of them. Let's see what happens if black puts the rook in front of the pawn with rook a1. After king g3 and a2, black is threatening to play rook g1 check and promote the pawn on the next turn. White plays the important rook a3 check, placing the rook behind black's passed pawn. After black's king moves to safety with king b6, white needs to deal with black's threat of rook g1, checking the king and clearing the promotion square for the pawn. One idea is to play king f2. Although this move prevents any checks on the first rank, it turns out white has made a serious blunder. After rook h1, black is threatening to promote the pawn. The only way to prevent this threat is to play rook takes a2. White captures the pawn, but now the king and rook are lined up on the same rank, so black wins the rook with the skewer rook h2 check, capturing white's rook on the next turn. After king b6, white should play king g2, controlling the h1 square and preventing black's rook h1 trick. After king b5, king h2, white can safely move the king between h2 and g2 until black attacks white's rook with king b4. Since white's rook is behind the passed pawn, it can move all the way down the board with rook a8. The rook still puts pressure on black's pawn, and after king b3, once the king protects the pawn, threatening to move the rook off the promotion square, white simply checks the king with rook b8 check. If black tries to protect the pawn, white's rook will continue to check the king. If the king moves away from the pawn, such as with king c3, white simply returns to attacking the pawn with rook a8. Black cannot make progress, and the game is drawn. Since moving the rook in front of the passed pawn did not work out for black, a much better idea is to put the rook behind the passed pawn, starting with rook d4 check, gaining a tempo against the king to place the rook behind the pawn. After king g3, rook a4, black is ready to advance the pawn, so white quickly blocks the promotion square after rook c1, a2, rook a1. As we saw in previous examples, an active king is very important. Both sides rush to bring the kings to the action after king b6, king f3, king b5, king e3, king b4, king d2, and king b3. Black is ready to play king b2 and force the rook to move, but white's king prevents this with king c1. Has white saved the game? Not if black forces the king away from the critical b2 square with rook c4 check. After king d2 and king b2, black forces the rook to move and will promote the pawn on the next turn. Can you make the most of the rook in the endgame? Let's see.